you. Shall I? Let's start, Shivani. Right?
We'll just wait for a minute or two for people to join.
Okay. Okay.
All right, as we are waiting for everybody to join in, welcome. Thank you for taking out the time to attend this session. We are going to try and do a bilingual session on the IPCC third report and its specific relevance to Northern India as much as possible. And Seemaji and I will moderate the session. It will be bilingual, so please feel free to speak in whatever language that you're most comfortable in. Just a request to keep yourself on mute when you're not speaking. Just as a note, we have members of the press in the room. The session is being recorded, and press members are requested to, if you're quoting anybody from the panel, to just confirm the quotes before writing your stories. This will be a 90-minute session, and we'll leave the last 15 minutes for any questions. So do keep typing adding your questions to the Q&A, and we'll try and take it up in between or at the end of the session. And with that, I will hand over to Seema ji.
यहाँ पे मौजूद सभी लोगों को मेरा नमस्कार। और आज हम लोग यहाँ इसलिए जुड़े हैं कि जो आईपीसीसी की ताज़ा रिपोर्ट है जो अप्रैल के पहले हफ्ते में जारी हुई, उसमें क्लाइमेट चेंज मिटिगेशन के बारे में कि क्या प्रासंगिकता है, उस पर एक चर्चा करने के लिए जुड़े हैं, खासतौर से हिंदुस्तान के, और हिंदुस्तान में भी जो नॉर्दर्न हिंदी बेल्ट है, जो उसके उत्तरी हिस्सा है, जो हिंदी बहुल्य क्षेत्र है, उसके लिए क्या प्रासंगिकता है। अप्रैल के पहले हफ्ते में जारी आईपीसीसी वर्किंग ग्रुप 3 की रिपोर्ट ये बताती है कि दुनिया जलवायु परिवर्तन से होने वाली तबाही को कैसे रोक सकती है, और ये बताती है हमें ये भी कि ग्लोबल वार्मिंग को 1.5 डिग्री सेल्सियस तक रोकने के लिए दुनिया को 2030 तक अपने कार्बन डाइऑक्साइड और ग्रीन हाउस गैसेस का उत्सर्जन को 45% तक कम करने की जरूरत है। साथ ही उसे अपने कोयले पर आधारित बिजली को चरणबद्ध तरीके से टाइम के साथ उसे खत्म करने की जरूरत होगी, तब ये जो पेरिस एग्रीमेंट का लक्ष्य था ये दुनिया हासिल कर सकती है, और इसके बिना ये लक्ष्य पूरा नहीं होगा। और अगर हमने ऐसा नहीं किया तो हम जो हैं इस दुनिया को तबाही से बचाने में नाकाम हो सकते हैं। ऐसा इसलिए हो रहा है क्योंकि साइंटिस्ट लगातार देख रहे हैं कि पिछले 2000 सालों की तुलना में तापमान इस वक्त तेजी से बढ़ रहा है, बहुत ज्यादा गर्मी हो रही है, अनबेरेबल हीट, अनलिवेबल हीट, गर्मी, बेड बल्ब टेम्परेचर, इस सब का सामना हो रहा है। और ये देखा है कि उत्सर्जन में वृद्धि जो थी या उनमें तेजी से बढ़ोतरी जो प्री पेंडेमिक स्तर पे फिर से पहुंच गई है। पेंडेमिक के जमाने में ये कम हुआ था, मगर फिर वापस प्री पेंडेमिक लेवल पे पहुंच गया है उत्सर्जन। ऐसे में पेरिस समझौते को पूरा करने के लिए एक ही रास्ता बचा है। आईपीसीसी के रिपोर्ट के मुताबिक अगले 8 साल में, यानी इस सदी के अंत तक, हमें अपने उत्सर्जन में, एमिशंस में गिरावट जो है वो 50% या 45% कम करनी होगी, आधी कर देनी होगी। तभी हम दुनिया को ग्लोबल वार्मिंग से होने वाली तबाही से बचा सकते हैं। और अगर ये बात किसी क़यामत के दिन का पैगाम नहीं है तो बताओ क्या होगा। एक तरह से ये दुनिया के विनाश का पैगाम ही है। हालांकि ये बात सही है कि विंड, सोलर जैसी सब क्लीन टेक्नोलॉजीज में बहुत तेजी से विकास हो रहा है, प्रगति हो रही है और दुनिया की इसमें मदद हो रही है क्लीन टेक्नोलॉजी की तरफ जाने में या अपने एमिशंस को कम करने में। ये रिपोर्ट एक ऐसे वक्त पे आई जब यूक्रेन पे रूस के आक्रमण की वजह से कीमतों को झटका लगा और अचानक से एनर्जी और खाने की कीमतों पर प्रभाव पड़ रहा है। लेकिन फिर भी दुनिया के बहुत से हिस्से जो हैं बहुत तेजी से रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी को अपनाने के लिए तेजी से त्वरित कदम उठा रहे हैं। हमें जलवायु को लक्ष्यों को प्राप्त करने के लिए बहुत सी ऐसी टेक्नोलॉजीज हैं, बहुत नेसेंट हैं, जो नवजात हैं और खाद्य प्राकृतिक आधारित समाधान हैं। इन सब का इस रिपोर्ट में मिटिगेशन को बहुत से लोग मैं क्योंकि बहुत से जर्नलिस्ट साथी भी, पत्रकार साथी इसमें मौजूद हैं, मैं ये कहना चाहूंगी कि शमन जो है मिटिगेशन का सही अर्थ नहीं है। हिंदी में शमन का मतलब तो दमन होता है या जबरदस्त रोकथाम, मगर किसी उपद्रव की होती है। ये सही है कि जलवायु परिवर्तन भी एक तरह का उपद्रव ही है या विद्रोह ही है जिसका दुनिया सामना कर रही है, मगर शायद मिटिगेशन का सही सेंस रोकथाम अगर हम लें तो हिंदी में सही रहेगा, ज्यादा बेहतर रहेगा, क्योंकि हम दमन तो उसका कर नहीं सकते, रोकथाम ही कर सकते हैं। तो इस रिपोर्ट में मिटिगेशन के तरीकों और तमाम गहन क्षेत्रीय विश्लेषण से लेकर फाइनेंसिंग, अंतर्राष्ट्रीय सहयोग, नेट जीरो, कार्बन डाइऑक्साइड हटाने, ऐसे तमाम जितने सब्जेक्ट्स हैं उनका एक बहुत व्यापक स्पेक्ट्रम जो है वो इस डिस्कशन में शामिल किया गया है। Now I hand over with this introduction. I hand over it to Shivani to invite the speakers.
Thank you, Seema ji, for setting the stage and sort of giving us a background of this report. I would like to introduce our eminent panel, starting with Mr. Parth Bhatia, who is an associate fellow for CPR, Center for Policy and Research, and he's also a contributing author for this, one of the chapters of the Ipcc Working Group 3 report, which is the chapter on policy and institutions. Welcome, Parth. I'd also like to introduce Professor Samdarshi, who is very well known in Jharkhand. He's a part of the Central University of Jharkhand in the Department of Engineering, Energy Engineering. Welcome, Professor Samdarshi. I'd like to now introduce Aditya Lola, who is a senior electricity policy analyst with EMBER. Nice to have you on board. And lastly, Manish Ram, who is a researcher at LUT Finland, also working on energy issues for a very, very long time. So welcome, everybody. And without taking any further time, I'd like to request Parth, if you have, since you're an author of the report, I just wanted to check if you have any, start off with your views on the key messages that the report has sort of, put out there for policymakers and the world at large, and anything specific on India. So if you would like to share your views on that.
Thank you everyone. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you Seema ji, thank you Shivani, Gunjan for organizing this, and it's really a pleasure to be here with all the other panelists. So quickly share my slides if you don't mind. I do have a couple of slides. I'll try and wrap up in possibly less than 10 minutes. So just before we start, right? I feel like Seema ji gave a very nice introduction about what the IPCC report is and what is the significance of this report. ये जो report है, this is the third report in this assessment cycle of the IPCC. So last 6-7 years में जो भी literature आया है, जो भी scientific papers आए हैं, there are 3 reports, one looking at the science, one looking at the impact and vulnerability. So the science as in the physical science, the geophysics, one looking at the impacts and vulnerability, and this is the third one on mitigation, like what is the way forward, what are the actions we can take. And then there are some 17 chapters looking at different topics. So I am a contributing author on the policies and institutions chapter. So I mean, the nature of this report is that no one person is an expert on everything that the report says, except maybe the co-chairs of the IPCC. But I'll try my very best to actually just give you a brief summary of what are the main messages coming out of this report. And then I will end my presentation with one slide on some key questions for India. It's not really IPCC practice for authors to actually comment on specific countries. In fact, it's specifically not advised. ऐसा बोला जाता है कि ये रिपोर्ट किसी एक कंट्री को कुछ पॉलिसी प्रिस्क्रिप्शन देने का रोल नहीं करना चाहती है. You can just talk in general terms. You can tell what the assessment is, but there is no sort of high-level message which is sort of directly targeted to India. But I'll just do my best to give my perspective on it, and I think the rest of the panelists can pick up threads from it. Just quickly, what are the key messages coming out from the IPCC report? The first message is that emissions are continuing to grow. Recent years में थोड़ा slowdown हुआ है emissions में, but almost all the major greenhouse gases, CO2 included, methane, nitrous oxide, all of them are continuing to grow. And आज की तारीख में जो emissions हैं, they are the highest ever in recorded, like since we have started recording sort of anthropogenic emissions. That's number one. And the second thing is cumulatively over the last 150 or so years, we have spent almost 4/5 of the global carbon budget, which is available to keep the warming level below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So almost 80% of the carbon budget has already been consumed, and very few, sort of a small proportion of it is left. And obviously there are sort of historical responsibilities and inequities in who has consumed it. And India has always been a champion of this position globally. But I mean, just going forward, I think all the countries are sort of in agreement that we have to try to do everything possible to reduce these emissions, keeping in mind that there are differentiated responsibilities and sort of different capabilities in countries. Okay. In terms of the impacts, I mean, just a very quick slide from what Working Group 2 says. A, we are already above 1.1 degrees Celsius. This is what the Working Group 1 has said. B, around 3.3 to 3.6 billion. So nearly half of humanity lives in hotspots of high vulnerability to climate change. So places where one or the other impact, so cyclones, droughts, heat waves, flooding, something or the other, around half of humanity is very vulnerable, highly vulnerable, and they live in it. This is what the Working Group 2 report says. A third message which is coming out is simultaneous extreme events are increasing, right? So एक time पे ऐसा नहीं है कि खाली cyclone आएगा या फिर खाली flood आएगा. काफी संभावना है कि जहाँ heat stress मौजूद है वहीं पे हो सकता है फ्लड भी आ जाए, हो सकता है बारिश का पैटर्न बदल जाए. एंड उसका इम्प्लीकेशन ये है कि गवर्नमेंट्स, स्पेशली डिजास्टर मैनेजमेंट अथॉरिटीज, लोकल गवर्नमेंट्स, पीपल, दे विल बी वेरी स्ट्रेस्ड बिकॉज you have to handle 2 or 3 disasters at one time, which is not an easy task at all. Fourth thing is that it is going to overlap with existing developmental challenges, right? So the vulnerability is present in places where there is already poverty, for example, right? Jahan pe agriculture hai, heat stress already hai, jahan pe there isn't, for example, an air conditioner in every house or even a fan in every house. In those places, the the risks are more because the governments and the organizations responsible are not able to protect people through adaptation, right? So the overall sort of recommendation from the Working Group 2 report is that all countries need to move in a climate resilient direction. And all countries sort of need to do this, not just because of climate change, but otherwise also, if we don't move in a climate resilient development, our general development, our sustainable development goals will be at risk. So it's not just a climate issue. Your poverty goals will be at risk. Your education goals will be at risk. Your political situation might get destabilized. That's a message. And the overall message from Working Group 3 report, the mitigation report, is that you need immediate and deep emission reductions across all sectors to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius. So Seema ji ne already kaha hai ke 25 to 43% is roughly what the number says by 2030. But even if you sort of discount what specific model says, the main message is 1.5 degrees agar karna hai, so agle 5 saal mein by 2025 we should try and peak our emissions. Some countries can do it later, but that means some other countries have to do it earlier. So if India wants to peak its emissions by 2035, then some countries would have to start doing it now, so that on average it's as early as possible, the average peak, right? Now, in terms of sort of the steps forward, because this is a forward-looking mitigation report, what can we do? The sort of key messages is that options are already available, right? Technologies, policies, tools, we have, the report has studied it, and it's now thought that around half of the global emissions can be cut by 2030 at a price level of less than $100 per ton. And on the chart on the right, you can see that these options are sort of available across sectors. In some sectors, there is more mitigation potential, such as energy and forestry and land and agriculture. But of course, in forestry, land and agriculture, because the bars are red, that means the costs are higher. But the thing that I would like to bring your attention to is look at the blue bars. Jahan pe graph mein blue hai, the IPCC report basically says that these technologies are currently less expensive than the business as usual technologies, right? So solar and wind till 2 gigatons can be done in a manner or in locations where it's less expensive than the alternatives. And then after that, if you want to do more solar and more wind, then it sort of becomes more and more expensive. So in many places, cost savings are already possible. I'll try and move a bit faster. In some cases, renewable prices have fallen below those of fossil fuels. I think everybody knows this. Renewables and battery prices are falling exponentially. Nothing groundbreaking, but it's 85% in a decade, which is quite a lot. What is the role of fossil fuels in low carbon futures? And here I'm just talking about models, right? Like this is not a prescription, but in the modeled scenarios, without CCUS, without capturing the carbon coming from the coal plants, around 58 to 90% of the coal use needs to reduce by 2030 if you want to stay within the safe limit of 1.5. And by 2050, the models say that coal overall, including CCS, needs to reduce around 90%, oil by 25%, gas consumption by 40%. This is reduction, not reduction in growth, reduction in absolute terms by 2050. And almost all electricity in particular should come from no or low carbon fossil fuels. And इसका implication ये है, इसका मतलब आज की तारीख में हमें इससे क्या मैसेज लेना चाहिए? इसका ये मैसेज ये है कि coal assets in particular, coal plants are at risk of becoming stranded or non-performing assets by 2030, and oil and gas assets become at risk towards 2050. So coal in particular, I think, is highlighted as something which is going to be an economic risk if it's not dealt with in some equitable way. Another message from the report is around demand. Individuals क्या कर सकते हैं, cities क्या कर सकती हैं, groups क्या कर सकते हैं, and इसमें ये नहीं है कि खाली आप अपना electricity consumption रोकिए या फिर electricity use मत कीजिए. The message is, what can countries and governments and designers and city planners do to make it possible for individuals to reduce their demand? So you have to provide the right technology. For example, energy efficient LEDs, right? It will help you reduce your demand. You have to provide the right infrastructure. So if your cities are walkable, agar aapki cities mein chalne ki jagah hai, cycling ki jagah hai, that can actually help reduce the demand. Teleworking, for example, is something which can actually help reduce transport demand or even like aviation demand, right? And the potential which is calculated for these demand side strategies is very high. Around half of your emissions can come by actually changing the way and shaping the way people demand energy. And there is also a role of the way the choices are presented to people, right? Like can you make it easier for people to reduce their food waste? Can you make it easier for people to choose green electricity? Those are sort of questions that the report raises. And the goal here is to avoid lock-in, right? Like a country like India, हमारा गोल क्या होना चाहिए? हमारा गोल ये होना चाहिए कि हम जो डेवलप्ड वर्ल्ड के पैटर्न्स हैं of lots of cars, lots of wasteful energy consumption, lots of luxury energy consumption, we should avoid that, locking into those patterns, even for our own sake, and we should sort of try to grow sustainably, right? Now, how do we do this? The report, especially our chapter on policies and institutions, says that you need dedicated institutional solutions. Governments को अपनी हर लेवल पे, नेशनल लेवल पे, बट ऑल्सो सिटी और स्टेट लेवल पे गवर्नमेंट्स को अपनी कैपेसिटी बढ़ाने की जरूरत है. इसके लिए इंटरनेशनल सपोर्ट की भी जरूरत है. 4 चीजें करने के लिए. One is coordination. You have to coordinate across different sectors. So energy and food and water and air pollution policies have to work together. Strategy setting. अगर आपने 2070 का लक्ष्य रखा है नेट जीरो, तो आज की तारीख में आपको क्या एक्शंस लेने हैं टू रीच इट. कंसेंसस बिल्डिंग, which is whoever loses their jobs or livelihood, or even promoters who are invested in fossil fuel assets. How do you bring those winners and losers along, right? How do you ensure that society is accepting these transitions? And finally, the implementation capacity, right? So these are sort of big messages that governments need to be more capable of helping countries and helping individuals drive these changes. And one of the sort of examples of how to do it is through establishing things like the Just Transition Commissions. So this figure actually shows that world में कई सारे countries हैं जिन्होंने equity और justice को आगे रखते हुए किसी तरह का plan या किसी तरह का international dialogue, just transition dialogue, framework, commission रखने की कोशिश की है, ताकि coal region के लोगों की भी जो उनकी issues हैं, उनके जो opinions हैं, वो अकाउंट में लिए जा सके. That is the only way of being equitable and having a just transition. There's also an important role for subnational action. So यहाँ पे I think cities और states का क्या role है? खाली national level countries पे action नहीं हो पाएगा. What can cities do? Right? So cities का importance क्यों है? One is they are actually the source of experimentation. कई सारे नए models cities और states से आते हैं which then get adopted at national level. Cities and states are responsible for things like waste collection, sewage, supply of water. All these things are energy intensive. There's a lot of potential to do action there, but they require a lot of financial support and capacity support. But you've seen that 10,500 cities around the world have already voluntarily pledged to take action. And of that, 826 cities have adopted net zero targets. Most of these are in the West. But cities are themselves wanting to do it for their own reasons, for their own developmental reasons. And there's a big role for organized action by political parties, youth, labor, sort of indigenous people, local communities, to support cities and states in doing this. So the final slide from me is, what are the key questions for India and the energy transition in the Hindi heartland emerging from this report? The number one question is, how best do we decarbonize our electricity sector? And on this, I will sort of hope that the other panelists who are electricity experts will give us some insights on the way forward. Another big question is, how do we design our growing cities, right? How do we make sure that they grow in a manner that they are moving towards zero energy cities rather than moving towards high consumption polluted cities in the future? The third big question which is emerging is, how do we ensure justice and equity in transitions, especially in the coal belt and like the poorest people who have contributed the least? How do we make sure that they don't suffer because we are trying to mitigate for a global reason where others are responsible. And the fourth is the big question: how can India sort of shift its overall development pathway towards sustainability, right? It's no longer about just putting solar panels or doing one or two technologies well. The question is, अगर आपका country 50 साल के बाद बहुत अलग दिखने वाला है compared to what it is today, what can you do to change structural things, right? And I think electricity is a big starting point. Cities, transport are also very important in this. And I hope we can engage in some of these things over the course of the conversation. And I'm looking forward to hearing from the rest of the panelists and also from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Parth. बहुत बहुत आपका शुक्रिया. Do we have any questions, Shivani?
We'll do the questions at the end, Seemaji.
Okay, so how about you go ahead and introduce the next speaker?
Right. Thank you so much, Parth. I think you covered through your presentation a breadth of issues, right, from individual sort of behavior and how that can be facilitated, at an institutional level. And hopefully we can get into some level of depth in this sort of webinar itself. But as you said, electricity might be a good starting point, and the northern grid within that becomes, is one of the most prominent grids of the 5 grids in India. And Manish has worked extensively on the northern grid, and so I'd like to hand over to Manish to talk a little bit about that.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Shivani, and thank you everybody at Climate Trends for organizing this. And it was nice to hear Parth also sort of set the stage for what the IPCC report says. So I'll just share my screen too, and I have a presentation where we sort of can just go through from, I think, pretty much what Parth has been saying and how these solutions could look like for North India. So yeah, I think this pretty much Parth already sort of covered. So I just reiterate that, yeah, this IPCC report's been by far the most progressive in a way, and has sort of covered a lot of the energy transition scenarios, which were mostly previously left behind. And I am from that school of thought where we've always been pushing for more aggressive and more ambitious energy transition scenarios. And it was good to see that the IPCC report covered them this time. And so it's the most ambitious ones here from C1 to C4, sort of lay out the kind of pathways that we need to get most of the countries going. And I think for India, that's like one of the messages that 2070 might not seem the most ideal net zero pathway, but I think it's way before that. And even given that the costs of renewables and the other technologies are declining so fast, so it also becomes a challenge to sort of delay the transition a lot further. So I think there is a lot of work for all of us to sort of see how the Indian energy transition towards net zero can be more sort of fast-tracked. And also, like Parth pointed out, wind and solar this time have sort of emerged as one of the key technologies. And given that the blue bar is quite indicative that the costs have also come down drastically, well, at least me personally, I would say that the IPCC still has a little bit of work to catch up there. I mean, the costs are even more quite sort of at the lower end of the spectrum. So even in countries like India, we've seen that India has played a prominent role in driving down the cost of solar and even wind to a great extent. So there, I think we would see in the coming versions of the report that there will be a lot more role for solar and wind. So now sort of coming to India, so we've been doing a lot of analysis for energy transition scenarios in India and also for different parts of the world. And in India, we've sort of seen this stark difference emerge, right? So we've seen like mostly you could say the richer states or the states with better infrastructure, like the southern states and the western states, is where a lot of the development is happening. And you can also see like the penetration of renewables in a way in terms of the entire system, we see that states like Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Rajasthan, and Gujarat, and mostly Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, and even Maharashtra to a certain extent. So these have been the states that have been sort of driving the renewables push, whereas the North Indian states, to a large extent, are still yet to catch up, especially states like Uttar Pradesh, which has great potential. I think there a lot of work has to happen, and obviously then that gets down to the point that even Parth was making is we need policies at the state level and at the city level. So this is something that also sort of emerged out from our studies, that there is this stark difference that's sort of growing. And we also spoke to some of the utilities in Karnataka and Gujarat, and they have a problem now that they have too much renewables. So it's like they're saying we're struggling with a lot of renewables, and we don't want to sort of have any more in the grid. So it's kind of a contradicting situation when you see at one state there is not enough, and then other state is saying that we need to sort of curtail the renewables in a way to ensure that the grid is functional. So this is where we see that, yeah, different technologies like storage and flexibility needs to start coming into the system, and there we could sort of see a role for the different development pattern that will happen across the country. And with that thing, we have also did a study for the North Indian grid. So we sort of worked with Climate Trends, and we had this report where we've looked at the North Indian grid more specifically. And also, like Parth was suggesting, the city like Delhi, which is going to become one of the biggest cities on the planet, maybe by 2030, 2040. I think Delhi has a big role in also then to sort of steer the transition in the whole northern grid, and it is the biggest demand center in a way in the northern grid. And how this demand center can then sort of influence the policies in the states surrounding, because it's quite clear that Delhi will depend a lot on the surrounding states for itself to get energy. So in a way, there has to be some sort of a push from the biggest demand center, which would be Delhi, and then sort of work with the neighboring states of UP, Haryana, and Rajasthan to a great extent. So this kind of an approach could also, in a way, help. So we see that at least in the point of view that we did a cost optimization, and it was quite clear that solar will emerge as one of the biggest technologies in providing the least cost energy source for the whole North Indian grid. And we could also see that the costs are definitely quite stable, even though we don't consider the greenhouse gas emission cost, then we see that the cost will decline towards 2050. So from a levelized cost of energy point of view also, it is quite sensible to start moving quickly towards solar and the entire transition towards more technologies such as batteries, and also to a great extent green hydrogen would help. So some of the sort of global trends is what I wanted to highlight, is also what will happen in countries like India. So we've seen that electrification is one major trend that's sort of taking shape, and this is going to play a key role towards in all sort of sectors. So we have production of electricity, heat, and wind in transport. So it's quite clear that from an efficiency point of view, from a pure systems efficiency point of view, that electrification would sort of make the whole energy system a lot more efficient. So there have been enough studies to sort of say this, and this is something that India and states around North India should start taking notice of, and try to push more of the industrial process heating and also transport towards more electrification, because this is where they can stand to gain. And then the other big thing that we are also seeing in most countries now taking shape is the entire power to X sort of supply chain. And there was also quite recently Reliance, which was quite bold enough to sort of also say that they are trying to move their entire supply chain towards more of green hydrogen, and where hydrogen will then play a base for a lot of other products that would sort of come out of that. So we would definitely have a lot of requirement for e-fuels and e-chemicals. And in that whole sort of supply chain, I think green hydrogen will emerge as a key component. And this is something to be taken note of, and especially states like Uttar Pradesh and even Rajasthan, which are like which have great potential, not only the excellent solar resources, but also great human resource, can sort of think about developing these technologies already and then start supplying to demand centers such as Delhi and so on. And this sort of to capture the entire trend of what's happening. So I think sort of also Parth also pointed out that the costs of PV systems and costs of battery systems have been declining, but also the important point along with that is the costs of electrolyzers are sort of declining. And with more scaling up of this production of this technology, then we could also see a faster decline. And I think when India missed the kind of buzz with the whole solar PV manufacturing, I think India has a great opportunity to now start looking at manufacturing electrolyzers and the other components that sort of complement the whole growth of PV and wind. So there, I think there's a great opportunity for states like Uttar Pradesh and Rajasthan to sort of invest more in these technologies and then start enabling the manufacturing and also then create jobs around these places and then also to help the transition happen. And another key component would also be the DAC, which is like what we call it as direct air capture of carbon. And we've seen that DAC technologies will also play a key role to complement, the entire transition, because there we need some source of carbon to then couple it with the hydrogen to create all these other supply chain of e-chemicals and other e-fuels. So there is going to be a great demand, and the costs of DAC also have been declining over the years. So I think that's also a great technology for policymakers to think about. And in terms of the Ipcc, we've sort of did an analysis to see like what are the kind of studies that are out there. And we saw that like most of the studies in the world have like focused on the developed world, where we see like there's a huge difference between the developing and the developed world in terms of what sort of research is out there in terms of what sort of energy systems and how they can transition and so on and so forth. So I think this just to highlight how the difference is. And I think in a way in India also we see that sort of happening now, that the focus has been on the richer states of the Western and the Southern states, but I think the focus now needs to be on the Northern states and where there is sort of more potential to do stuff. And in a way that also sort of leads to the whole point that, I mean, there's always the argument that, it is expensive and we cannot do it as fast as the rest of the world. But I think with the cost declining so rapidly, I think that also leaves a question of, can these states and can these countries sort of afford not to do or not to get on to the more rapid transition pathway, because that will be a huge opportunity cost. And there, I think states like the Northern India states, which have already been quite slow in terms of catching up, despite the kind of quite elaborate renewable energy policies of the center, they have not been able to take advantage of all these policies in a way, and the states have sort of remained more reluctant. So I think here there's a good opportunity for the states in North India to start actively looking at what's happening within the country and also globally, to then position themselves to sort of tap into this transition and gain more for their people and so on and so forth. Yeah, I think we could obviously discuss a lot more, and it'd be great to get questions and opinions from other folks. I think I'll stop here and then we could discuss more.
Thank you so much, Manish. Many important points in terms of grid flexibility, different technologies, why the northern states are not really catching up, despite the fact that the costs of renewables are dipping so fast. And of course, as Parth said, renewables is not like the silver bullet, but given that it is an important part of the mitigation strategy that India should adopt, and India's set out big goals for itself. I'd just like for Aditya to weigh in and talk a little bit about renewables, why maybe some of the northern states are not being able to make most of the policies and the support that is being provided, and even from a larger perspective, where we stand.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shivani. सबको मेरा नमस्कार, गुड आफ्टरनून एंड जैसे मैं शुरू करूंगा। अब जो पार्थ जी और सीमा जी ने पहले उनके लाइक एक्सप्लेनेशन में वो कह रहे थे कि अब डीप एमिशन रिडक्शंस हमको इस नेक्स्ट 10 इयर्स में चाहिए ही चाहिए, पूरी दुनिया को करना चाहिए और उसमें इंडिया इज अ वेरी बिग पार्ट। तो इंडिया में अब ये ऐसी सिचुएशन आ गया है जहाँ पे एक तरफ हमको एमिशंस के रिडक्शंस करने हैं और दूसरी तरफ हमको ये डेवलपमेंट का ट्रेन जो चल रहा है उसको जारी रखना भी है। तो लास्ट 10 इयर्स, लास्ट 20 इयर्स में हमने कैसे किया वो सब कोल वाज अ वेरी बिग पार्ट ऑफ आवर डेवलपमेंट स्टोरी। तो अभी ये सिचुएशन आ गया कि हम ऐसे कंटिन्यू कर नहीं सकते। क्यों? क्योंकि लाइक अगर ये करेंगे तो हमारे एमिशन रिडक्शंस बढ़ जाएंगे। और अभी इंडिया भी लाइक इंडिया का इलेक्ट्रिसिटी डिमांड जो है वो भी इट इज एक्सपेक्टेड टू ग्रो एट 4 to 5%। ये आईईए कहती है, आईईए कहते हैं कि लाइक नेक्स्ट 10-20 इयर्स तक इंडिया इज प्रोबब्ली गोइंग टू बी वन ऑफ द फास्टेस्ट ग्रोइंग कंट्रीज इन द वर्ल्ड। तो वो डिमांड को हम कैसे मतलब लाइक मीट करेंगे, उसके लिए मनीष जी बोल रहे थे कि मनीष और पार्थ भी बोल रहे थे कि लाइक विंड एंड सोलर अभी इकोनॉमिकली चीप हो गए और वो दे रिप्रेजेंट a very like an economically feasible solution। तो वो ये ओवरनाइट तो हो नहीं सकता है। तो अभी हमारे यहाँ लाइक हमारे जो भी टारगेट्स है रेन्यूएबल्स के टारगेट्स, हम हमारे फर्स्ट हमारा टारगेट है 2022 का 175 गीगावाट रेन्यूएबल्स का और 2030 का 450 गीगावाट्स का। और दुनिया में सब एवरीबडी अप्रिशिएट्स दैट, वो टारगेट्स है, पर ग्राउंड में ये रियलिटी हो गया कि वो टारगेट पे हम पीछे पड़ रहे हैं। और ये टारगेट्स जो है स्टेट्स के भी टारगेट्स है और स्टेट्स में कुछ स्टेट्स अच्छे कर रहे हैं और कुछ स्टेट्स नहीं कर रहे हैं। मनीष जी बोल रहे थे कि साउथ के स्टेट जो कर्नाटक है और तेलंगाना है वहाँ पे वो टारगेट्स ऑलरेडी अचीव कर चुके हैं। और नॉर्थ में बस राजस्थान आगे है सबसे। राजस्थान ने अपने टारगेट 2022 का टारगेट जो भी है वो हासिल कर लिया है, पर देयर आर स्टेट्स लाइक उत्तर प्रदेश जहाँ पे वो 30% ऑफ देयर टारगेट भी नहीं है। तो मैं एक एग्जांपल देना चाहता हूँ यहाँ पे, मैं कंपेयर करना चाहूंगा राजस्थान और उत्तर प्रदेश को। राजस्थान और उत्तर प्रदेश के दोनों के टारगेट्स 2022 के 14 गीगावाट्स का टारगेट्स था और राजस्थान अभी 17 गीगावाट्स तक आ गए और उत्तर प्रदेश अभी भी 4 गीगावाट्स पर ही है। और ये नॉर्थन स्टेट्स में हर जगह पे लाइक स्टोरी सिमिलर है। उत्तराखंड में 1 गीगावाट का है, पंजाब में 2 गीगावाट्स, हरियाणा में 1 गीगावाट। तो यहाँ पे स्टोरी ये है कि कुछ स्टेट्स ने ये अडॉप्ट कर लिया है, मतलब दे आर वेरी लाइक प्रो रेन्यूएबल्स। तो इसके वजह से क्या हो रहा है, वो अभी लाइक हाल ही में आपने सुना होगा राजस्थान रेन्यूएबल एनर्जी एजेंसी दे मेड अ प्रॉफिट ऑफ 65 crores लास्ट ईयर, क्योंकि वो लोग रेन्यूएबल्स को अडॉप्ट इतना जल्दी कर लिया। And if you compare it with उत्तर प्रदेश में 90% ऑफ उत्तर प्रदेश का इलेक्ट्रिसिटी वो कोल से आता है और वहां पे कोल प्लांट्स का पीएलएफ गिरता आ रहा है, 69 से 61 तक आ गए लास्ट 5 सालों में। और इसके वजह से लाइक उनके प्रॉफिट्स भी, मतलब प्रॉफिट आफ्टर टैक्स अगर वो नंबर्स भी देखेंगे वो लॉस में ही चल रहे हैं। और ट्रांजिशन की जब बात करेंगे वो बहुत पीछे चले ही जा रहे हैं। तो राजस्थान हमको दिखाता है कि ये क्या क्या हो सकता है और उत्तर प्रदेश हमको ये दिखाता है कि मतलब हमको कहाँ से कहाँ जाना है। तो हम नॉर्थ इंडिया की बात करेंगे तो आई थिंक ये दोनों स्टेट्स हमको ये बैरोमीटर की तरह हम देख सकते हैं। वो पहली बात। सेकंड, मैं उत्तर प्रदेश के बारे में, हमने एम्बर में काम किया, आईफा के साथ लास्ट दिसंबर में एक रिपोर्ट भी लाइक लॉन्च किया है। उसमें हमको ये पता चला है कि उत्तर प्रदेश जो लाइक सबको ये पता है आबादी सबसे ज्यादा है, सेकंड हाईएस्ट पावर डिमांड है इंडियन स्टेट्स में अगर आप देखोगे महाराष्ट्र के बाद। और हमने ये वहाँ पे देखा है कि वहाँ पे कोल का रिलायंस बहुत ज्यादा ही है। वहाँ पे वो लास्ट लाइक अगर आप लाइक वो देखेंगे लास्ट 10 इयर्स में कोल कैपेसिटी 7 गीगावाट से लेकर 24 गीगावाट तक आ गया है। तो वो बहुत सारी कोल प्लांट जो है वो बहुत नए हैं, लाइक 10 साल के नीचे ही है। तो उसको इमीडिएटली वो बंद भी नहीं कर सकते। तो ये लॉक इन का प्रॉब्लम जो पार्थ जी ने बताया वो ये यहाँ पे आ जाता है। तो अभी उसके उसके ऊपर अभी 7 गीगावाट का अभी कंस्ट्रक्शन में और 3 गीगावाट और अभी वो पाइपलाइन में भी है। सो अगर वो भी अगर आ जाएंगे तो ये लॉक इन तो होगा ही, मतलब पैसे तो फर्स्ट लाइक वेस्ट हो जाएंगे क्योंकि ये स्टैंडर्ड एसेट्स बन जाएंगे जैसे पार्थ जी ने बताया। उसके बाद लाइक रेन्यूएबल का कैपेसिटी बढ़ नहीं रहा है, तो उसके वजह से हम उत्तर प्रदेश को इस मतलब कोल पे ही निर्भर रहना पड़ेगा नेक्स्ट 5 to 10 ईयर्स में। तो वो ट्रांजिशन का स्टोरी भी डिले कर देगा। और ये इसीलिए इंपॉर्टेंट है क्योंकि उत्तर प्रदेश इंडिया का, भारत का 10% इलेक्ट्रिसिटी वही इलेक्ट्रिसिटी कंजम्पशन वहीं पे होता है। सो ऐसे की स्टेट जो है लाइक अगर वहां पे लाइक हम वो बैटल अगर जीत जाएंगे ना, तो हम लाइक ये ट्रांजिशन जैसे मनीष जी बोल रहे थे, ये लीप फ्रॉग भी कर सकते हैं करके लाइक लाइक वो हमारे जो भी एम्बिशंस है, टारगेट्स है 500 गीगावाट नॉन फॉसिल कैपेसिटी, 450 गीगावाट रेन्यूएबल, ये सारी चीजें हासिल करने के लिए ये स्टेट लेवल पे भी बहुत वर्क होने की जरूरत है। तो मैं आई थिंक मैं यहाँ पे रोकूंगा और आई ट्राई एंड आंसर मोर क्वेश्चंस बाद में जब Q&A में, एंड आई हैंड इट ओवर टू यू शिवानी।
Thank you so much, Aditya. I think very important insights on the RE sector specifically. I am going to, request Professor Samdarshi, who comes from, CUJ, to talk about what does it mean for a state like Jharkhand, which is so dependent on coal. And I think that a state like Jharkhand is going to see the maximum change over the decade, or the coming few decades. And like Parth said again, it's important from the perspective even of just transition. So I just request if you have either a presentation or if you could speak a little bit on what an alternative energy system could look like for the state. What does it mean possibly for the livelihoods in the state that are dependent on this source of energy, and how that can assist India's mitigation efforts?
Thank you very much, Shivani. Is it audible?
Yes, you are
Audible. Okay. Thank you very much. I heard Madam Seema Javed. उन्होंने काफी अच्छा इंट्रोडक्शन दिया, and then Parth, Manish, just now Aditya also. Actually, I got a lot of material from whatever you have told, because I'm as a teacher, I'm a teacher of energy, and I'm a hardcore, means I do research in, for example, heat transfer and then photoactive materials. And then, for example, solar cooker is another area in which I work. So it becomes slightly, means my area or the way I think is slightly different from the way probably a person who is associated with IPCC activities will think, because your thinking is more towards what will be the policy and planning for mitigation, adaptation, finance, etc. I'm more concerned with conversion, conservation, and demands capture related technologies. That is what. So whenever the previous speakers, they told something related to that, I thought, okay, I'm really at the right place, and I can give some input. First thing regarding Jharkhand. All right, Jharkhand has done really very bad in renewables, and I came here about 6-7 years back. So I was really surprised at the state of renewables in Jharkhand, and I started contacting people, either in state electricity, different means. Different organizations related to electricity, and then also Jharkhand State Electricity Regulatory Commission, because I became a member there. So I started knowing a few things, and overall condition is really very bad. But when we started putting, many people are working in Jharkhand. Now the current situation is that Jharkhand is now planning to install 20 gigawatt of solar in next 5 years. That is the planning. So that is a huge development. Another thing is that recently Jharkhand is trying to adopt a policy related to energy conservation. So as I talked, energy conversion and conservation, these are two different approaches for doing the same thing. So then when I spoke about this, on the next day, the ECBC code was adopted by Jharkhand Government Electricity Board. So that is another new development because see, energy conservation is a big thing which should be taken into account. It is not only energy generation. And then capture is another area in which we can work. And let me tell you, when you talk about Jharkhand, the thing which comes to your mind is coal, because 27% of the country's coal is produced here. So it will be impacted the most once this transition takes place. So we are also working in that area also. And one new development is that Jharkhand is now, coal will become a stranded asset. But one of the good developments is that Jharkhand will now be concentrating on coal bed methane. Coal bed methane is a technology which doesn't create much of pollution. All right, so it is because the carbon itself is used in the process. So that is one thing which has very recently it has happened in Jharkhand. So this is another thing, and Jharkhand has a problem of land use because there are so many acts, CNT related other acts, and there are so many other problems because of which land is not available. So solar installation was probably stuck. The development was not that much which was expected from Jharkhand. Although Jharkhand doesn't have a problem of funding. Funding is not a big issue in Jharkhand. Jharkhand has sufficient funds, but probably initiatives have not been taken because of the land and some other issues, also social issues were there because of which it has not happened. So, but when some of the speakers, they told about development in the comparing development in south, north, west, etc. Let me tell you one thing, that south, the coastal regions, no, south is basically coastal. So wind has contributed a lot in the share of renewables there. So that advantage was there, and because the cost of the wind was so low, and that is why renewable share has been very high there. And at that time when wind was was developing, the cost of solar had not gone down. All right, so solar didn't have any scope, and the gestation period of installation of solar is not very high. It is so is that with the wind. So when solar cost came down, Rajasthan took it up because Rajasthan, of course, the annual insolation is very high there. So of course, Jharkhand, Rajasthan became the first state where focus of the government went. So that is why Rajasthan developed. But let me tell you another thing about Jharkhand, which I stress again and again, and that is Jharkhand is a sunny state, because almost uh, just hello sir, थोड़ी देर बाद बात करते हैं. So actually that is the issue with Jharkhand, that because Jharkhand is a sunny state. So out of 365, 65 days are you can consider that to be cloudy, but 300 days are clearly very sunny. And sunny in Jharkhand means it is clean. You can see blue sky also in Jharkhand because it is also a rainy place. So that is second. And average temperature in Jharkhand is very low. It is not that dusty as it is there in Rajasthan. So all these three things make Jharkhand a very suitable place for solar energy. That is what I have probably been able to convey to the policymakers here. And I think now Jharkhand is moving ahead, and I am sure that Jharkhand will do well in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Samdarshi. It's very encouraging to know.
Is it audible?
Yes. Am I audible?
Yeah. Nice.
All right.
Thank you.
So, no, thank you so much for sharing what is going on in Jharkhand, and like you said, the big impacts will be on land, and there are huge plans on renewable scaling up as well. So definitely, it's one of the states that will see major change. Before we sort of take up any questions from, or I request, if there are any questions, if you can share it in the Q&A box. But I wanted to start in the meanwhile with some questions that I had, and maybe I'll start with you, Parth, if that's okay. Because of your inputs into the report on policies and institutions, my first sort of question is to you over the, in terms of climate policy. And it's the first time it has sort of entered mainstream. It even sort of was reflected in the budget speech, where the importance of climate change was underscored very, very clearly. I wanted to know from your perspective, and a little bit you already spoke to, that in addition to budgetary allocations and the announcement of programs, could you maybe throw some light on what are the possible institutional and policy changes that are needed for India to be able to move towards or achieve or target in terms of climate change in terms of mitigation?
Sure. Thank you so much. That's a tough question. I mean, I feel like if I had really great answers to it, I'd be also sort of talking to the policymakers. But I can tell you in general terms what the advice is in terms of institutions and policies. And here I'll also draw a little bit from our own work at CPR. So there'll be like a blurring of the lines between what the Ipcc report says and what we at CPR think. So policies and institutions को एक second के लिए separately देखते हैं. Institutions पे पहले आते हैं. Institutions में what is required, right? So the report says you need to build more institutions, stronger institutions, because काफी सारे challenges आएंगे, governance challenges, जो आज की तारीख में जिस तरह से हमारे institutions organized हैं, they will not be able to handle, right? So for example, अगर आपको एक technology लेके आनी है, which is having impact in 3 or 4 different sectors. For example, batteries has impacts on आपका minerals कहाँ से आ रहा है, it has impacts on your electricity sector, it has impacts on your transport sector, it has impacts on your waste sector. So you need some organization which will coordinate a bit more proactively, and also sort of take some of these strategic decisions, right? So that I think is what the report says, and I think we agree. So I mean, India can consider either sort of really strengthening up the Niti Aayog's sort of ability to sort of play this role of bridging between sectors, or India can think of putting some kind of new climate commission sort of a thing, which the UK has and now lots of countries have, whose job will be to mainly think about long-term climate action, what it needs, what are the strategic priorities. Agar lithium-based batteries India mein important rahengi, so can we have some kind of initial sort of proactive efforts to make sure that we have the supply of lithium, make sure that the energy security is not compromised because we get too dependent on one country. So it's one of these two ways, right? You strengthen existing national institutions or put a new one. But very, very important is that state level pay, you need much more capacity, because all the implementation happens at state and city levels, right? So national level pay, if the environment ministry comes up with a plan, uska kya waqt hai? Uski koi khas waqt nahi hai, because at the end of the day, the people who have to actually execute it are people at this municipality level or the city level, and then they have to actually manage the difficulties of implementation. In terms of policies, I'll again move quickly. So typically low climate policy सोचते हैं carbon tax या फिर emissions trading system, इस तरह की चीजें. But in reality, that has not been the case in India. Climate policy has always been broader than just carbon policy. Climate policy has been what energy policies are, what transport policies are. These are all ultimately climate policies. So what can we actually do, right? What are the steps forward? So one thing is, like you said, budgetary is right. Every time there's like a big budgetary package of some sorts, stimulus package, COVID stimulus package, or some kind of financial recovery package, if there is thoda sa climate ka consideration in it, like as long as you make sure that you are at least not funding the wrong things, even if you are not funding the right things, that will be a big step forward. India is considering a national carbon market, which can have an impact, but there are equity issues with a carbon tax or a carbon market of sorts, because you want to make sure that it doesn't become regressive, like the poorest don't get penalized for it. So you can fix it by sort of circulating the revenues from the carbon markets or the carbon tax to the poorest. And the third, and I think the more important thing, is that India needs to sort of come up with a set of policies for each major transition, right? So आपका transport sector में जो है, electricity sector, industry sector में जो है, don't go with one, go with a package, right? Go with 4 or 5 which collectively meet your development goals and your cost goals. Otherwise, the economic rationale is always to go for a most efficient policy. But is cost efficiency our number one concern? Not necessarily. Like, we have to take care of equity. We have to have policies in a package which take care of the information and behavioral change required. You need sort of to support industries in some cases, you need government procurement. So it will require policies for each sector which are coherent, and a set of policies which work together. And again, that comes back to institutions, right? Like an institution is needed to help you design those policies well. So I think that's kind of the message that we think is coming on policies and institutions.
Right. Thank you so much, Part, for that. I know there are no easy solutions, and going after one sector will also, there is no silver bullet at this point. It is really all hands on deck in that sense. And the most critical thing that the government needs to ensure is to keep equity in mind at the heart of it, even if it does go in for a carbon market for India. I think equity is something that needs to be at the heart of it, because as you said right at the start, the ones to suffer the most out, to get the most fallout of this entire, the climate crisis that is unfolding is the poorest of the poor. And not only in terms of either a flood or a drought, and it's going to be multiple things, an onslaught at the same time. So thank you for that. And I think Seema ji has her hand up. Seema ji, आपको कुछ अभी please.
नहीं, मेरा सवाल है एक्चुअली मनीष आपके लिए कि नॉर्दर्न ग्रिड इन इंडिया इज वेरी क्रिटिकल. उसके डीकार्बनाइजेशन के बिना इंडिया कैन नॉट अचीव इट्स 2030 क्लाइमेट टारगेट्स. And the decarbonization of the northern grid will help in India to retain its global image of a climate leader. So which of the northern states can decouple from fossil fuels and can help move towards clean energy systems in India? That's my question to you, Manish.
Well, thanks, Seemaji. I think we've sort of done this analysis with climate trends, and we've published a report. So I think that report sort of covers this very much in detail. But I think, like you pointed out, there is, well, the question is like, which are the states that are actually driving the renewable energy sort of transition in India? And we know clearly that it's been the southern states and the western states where also a lot of the investments are moving in. A lot of the infrastructure is being built around. So I think that the sort of challenge is a bit of push and pull. One is you have more proactive state governments that want to sort of attract all the investments and sort of also align their policies with what the national government is saying. Whereas in northern India, it's still been quite reluctant. I think the governments have not been really more proactive and trying to tap into what the central government is sort of also offering or sort of setting out in terms. And I think even like Delhi, in a way, the state in itself has not been like really pushing a lot in terms of trying to see how it can secure itself also, in a way, how it can secure its energy supply in the long term. Because I think like you're in Delhi, you know better, like there's always a problem, and then there's this like where the coal coming from, and then where the Delhi will keep relying on the coal power plant around, or should they start moving around? So I think there has to be a sort of a comprehensive thought process there, and I think that is what is sort of lacking. But I completely agree with you that the northern grid has to sort of contribute in order for the entire country to be able to achieve its transition. Otherwise, it's not possible. We quite well know that Uttar Pradesh is the biggest state and also one of the biggest consumers of electricity, as Aditya was mentioning. So with this big state in part of the northern grid, it's very crucial for the northern grid to sort of to transition as rapidly as possible, because given among all the regional grids, I think the northern grid is the one which is still the most heavily dependent on coal. I think Aditya has better statistics there, but yeah, so it's a big challenge for them also. So, but I think there's also a great complementarity with the northern states of Himachal Pradesh, and then there's excellent resources in Ladakh and Jammu and Kashmir with a lot of hydro and a lot of wind, and this can sort of create a more sort of a balanced portfolio of different renewable technologies. And the northern grid can actually benefit a lot, like we've seen also in the report, that the costs of electricity can come down quite significantly. And also, I think now, given that also, like Path was saying, it's not just the one sector of electricity, we have to also start thinking about it from a more of a systemic perspective, because the energy system as a whole is sort of changing. So it's not just the electricity sector or the transport sector or the industry sector, and we see all these three sectors having different interplays now. And also we see like solutions such as hydrogen, which will come up as a very key factor. So already putting a thought process in place, and these state governments becoming more proactive can actually try to attract some of the investments for manufacturing, probably electrolyzers, batteries, which already companies like Reliance are planning. And they want to shift again all their investments into places like Gujarat, where they see there's a lot of potential for them to again manufacture all of these technologies. But then this can also sort of move towards the northern states, and there they can sort of get more things going. And also we know that there's a huge population in states like Uttar Pradesh, where there's also a challenge of creating jobs. So I think by pushing the energy transition more aggressively, they can actually create a lot more jobs there, and also sort of tackle the whole socio-economic challenges that come along. So I think it has to be a bit of a push and pull, where the state governments have to become more proactive, and then also the central government policies need to shift more towards focusing on the northern grid.
Thank you, Manish. Thank you very much.
I had a question for Professor Samdarshi before. I think there's a question, that Jaydeep wants to ask, but I'll just take the liberty and ask you. You mentioned when you were speaking about finance, and you said finance is not one of the bigger issues in Jharkhand. But my question was, how are the enablers of finance, technology, and innovation moving across Jharkhand and maybe even the northern region? So maybe even Parth can weigh in, either of you or both of you can, if you can respond to this.
Parth should first tell, because finance is not my area exactly. The only thing I know is that because of the kind of royalty, etc., which Jharkhand gets, if they are able to direct it properly, then probably it will be. It is possible in Jharkhand. That is what. Please.
Thank you, Professor Samdarshi. I mean, finance is also not really my area, but I completely concur with you that there's the investment side of things, and then there's the public finance side of things, right? And investment side, it's absolutely clear that a lot of finance is needed. So if I can just quickly possibly share my screen one more time, just to show you guys one slide, which I hadn't included, unfortunately. But this is a chart from the technical summary on climate investment flows, and it sort of divides it by region, and it says that it compares what the existing climate average flows are and what's the mitigation investment needed until 2030, right? What is the factor of increase? And you can see that in developing countries, it's 4 to 8 times. So we need 4 to 8 times more finance. In developed countries, it's also 2 to 5 times. But if you notice where Southern Asia is, it's actually 7 to 16 times down here. I mean, the magnitude is lower than Eastern Asia because of China, but Southern Asia, the investment needs are basically 7 to 16 times. So that, I think, is absolutely badly required. I think even in a state like Jharkhand, Professor Sandarshi, like there might be some public revenues which are available, but if we go for a just transition, there will be a lot of demand for compensation, for new job creation, and those public revenues which are currently available will also be on the downwards path as we move forward, right? So unless Jharkhand sort of finds a new way of generating revenues from RE jobs or the RE economy, this stream is no longer a permanent stream, the royalties, etc. So investment, I think we absolutely have to, we cannot underestimate how badly investment is needed. International investment, of course, but various forms of private investment are required. I feel like I shouldn't overextend my expertise on this topic and go beyond that. Maybe if Manish or Aditya, if you guys have anything particular on finance for energy transition, please do come.
Yeah, if it's okay, I can add a couple of points there. आई थिंक जब हम फाइनेंस की बात करते हैं, दो चीजें होती है, एक फाइनेंस आरई कैपेसिटी बिल्ड करने के लिए, और एंड द अदर सेट ऑफ फाइनेंस टू एंश्योर दैट देयर इज जस्ट ट्रांजिशन हैपनिंग, व्हिच इज व्हाट पार्थ वाज रेफरिंग टू. फर्स्ट चीज के लिए इट्स नॉट जस्ट अबाउट थ्रोइंग मनी, इट्स ऑल्सो अबाउट हैविंग अ राइट एनवायरनमेंट, राइट मार्केट्स इन प्लेस, एंड वो भी सब नेशनल लेवल में. अभी इंडिया में लाइक यू नो द थिंग, इंडिया में ऐसा हो गया कि लेफ्ट हैंड राइट हैंड से बात नहीं कर रहा है. यू हैव सेंट्रल लेवल लाइक यू नो पॉलिसीज, सेंट्रल लेवल टारगेट्स, एंड देन स्टेट में लाइक यू नो कुछ स्टेट्स रेस्पॉन्ड कर रही है, कुछ स्टेट्स नहीं कर रही है. सो इसके वजह से लाइक नो देयर इज अ डिस्कनेक्ट. तो पहली बात तो हमें एक मार्केट, आरी मार्केट, मतलब स्ट्रॉन्ग मार्केट बनाना है. तो इसके लिए देयर आर अ लॉट ऑफ बैरियर. मतलब उसी पे मैं मतलब हाफ एन आवर बात भी कर सकता हूँ, पर अभी नहीं करूंगा. बट द थिंग इज इतने सारे बैरियर्स है व्हिच द गवर्नमेंट नीड्स टू एड्रेस, एंड एवरीथिंग स्टार्ट्स फ्रॉम अ नेशनल पॉलिसी. हमारे पास एक नेशनल पॉलिसी व्हिच इज कंसिस्टेंट फॉर 5 years ऐसा कुछ नहीं है. So we have national targets, and then like you know states have like you know their own set of policies जो coordinated नहीं हो रहे. तो इसके वजह से we have a lot of disconnect between the states, and that is holding India back also. So that is as far as the renewable capacity side of the things is concerned. Just transition के लिए like you know Parth mentioned that you know अभी like international finance की भी जरूरत है. इंडिया अभी एक्सप्लोर भी कर रहा है. लाइक साउथ अफ्रीका के साथ एक डील हुआ था, जस्ट ट्रांजिशन डील. सो इंडिया इज आल्सो एक्सप्लोरिंग सच डील्स. बट आई थिंक स्टेट गवर्नमेंट्स को भी थोड़ा प्रोएक्टिव होना चाहिए. वो भी मतलब ये डेवलपमेंट एजेंसीज, मल्टीलैटरल ऑर्गेनाइजेशंस के साथ कोऑर्डिनेट कर सकते हैं, कोलैबोरेट कर सकते हैं, एंड दे कैन गेट इनटू लाइक यू नो प्रोजेक्ट्स व्हिच कैन हेल्प देम ट्रांजिशन अवे फ्रॉम कोल इकोनॉमीज. तो ये हो रहा है, इंडोनेशिया में भी हो रहा है, इंडिया में भी काम अभी शुरू हो रहा है. बट बहुत सारी स्टेट्स अभी they haven't woken up yet on that. अभी उनको like you know आगे like you know जाके we need some proactive leadership and proactive policy making when it comes to subnational level transition. I'll just keep it at that.
Thank you for that, Aditya. Jaideep, I see you've sort of put your hand down. Do you still have a pending question? All right. If not, there are.
I would like to add a few things. Okay,
Yes,
so
please do.
Yeah. So actually, two examples I'll just now give. which is obviously related to my university, and that will probably give you some background of what is going on in Jharkhand. In 2014, our university got 2 megawatt solar offer from SECI. SECI 2 megawatt means 30% subsidy, and then I talked to the state. Everybody was ready, but what happened is that my university was not ready for that rooftop installation, so it could not happen. So that is one. So 2014, I'm talking about 8 years have passed since then, and now university is trying to have 1 megawatt. So that is one. Now, second is that our university, day before yesterday, we signed an MOU with Ministry of Skill Development. And we are a hub of training people of Jharkhand in different technologies. And of course, just transition is at the back of all these things, because jo bhi livelihood losses honge because of the transition from coal to renewable, let us say. So uske liye we have to be ready. So वो हम लोगों ने एक initiative लिया है, and we are now hub of that skill. Of course, we'll be involving other educational institutions also to take part in this. So these are the 2 informations I want to give you. Thank you.
Can I ask a question, Shivani?
Yes, please. I think there was a question in the chat also from Aarti to Professor Samdarshi.
Yeah, I think I have answered her question also. I went through that.
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Seemaji, please.
We all know that clean and renewable energy systems give the best chance of energy security, a safer and fairer world. And my question is to you, Aditya, that the countries that have adopted low carbon policies are already seeing a drop in emissions. India has set a target of 450 gigawatt and now maybe 500 gigawatt of RE. It has already reached 100 gigawatt, but recent reports suggest that India could miss the 2022 target by 27%. What does India have to do differently to achieve this target?
Yeah. So इंडिया के अभी जो भी रिसेंट टारगेट कॉप में हमने अनाउंस किया था, दैट इज 500 गीगावाट्स नॉन फॉसिल कैपेसिटी यानी आरई प्लस हाइड्रो प्लस न्यूक्लियर। और ये हमारे 2020 में ऑप्टिमल जनरेशन कैपेसिटी में रिपोर्ट सीईए ने पब्लिश किया था, उसमें हमारा 450 गीगावाट आरई का टारगेट था, which is only which includes solar, wind, small hydro and biopower. So पहली चीज वो I wanted to clear. उसके बाद the reason we are missing is because rooftop solar section में ये 175 gigawatts में 100 gigawatts solar से आना था, और 100 gigawatts में 60 from utility scale solar plants and 40 gigawatts from rooftop solar. और रूफटॉप सोलर में हम काफी पीछे पड़ गए, एंड दैट इज मेनली बिकॉज डिफरेंट स्टेट्स हैव रिस्पोंडेड डिफरेंटली टू दैट पर्टिकुलर टारगेट। कुछ स्टेट्स में द प्रोग्रेस हैज बीन मोर एंड कुछ स्टेट्स में इट हैज नॉट बीन। सो इसके वजह से अभी सोलर का कैपेसिटी 100 गीगावाट्स टारगेट में हम वी हैव ओनली रीच्ड 54 गीगावाट्स। तो इसके वजह से वी हैव काइंड ऑफ फॉलन बिहाइंड। उसके अलावा विंड पावर अगर आप देखोगे लास्ट 1 to 2 years में थोड़ा स्लो डाउन हो गया है। This is again mainly because कुछ states में PPA का problems are, power purchase agreements में चले जाते हैं, उसके बाद the discoms cancel those power purchase agreements। इसके वजह से क्या होता है, काउंटर पार्टी रिस्क भी बढ़ जाता है। इसका मतलब ये होता है कि अगर कोई जनरेटर को आरई का प्रोजेक्ट शुरू करना है, वो लोग इतना कॉन्फिडेंस के साथ नहीं आएंगे, क्योंकि उनको पता है कि ये डिस्कॉम उनका कॉन्ट्रैक्ट कैंसिल भी कर सकता है। और ये उत्तर प्रदेश में हुआ, ये कर्नाटका में हुआ, ये गुजरात में हुआ है। हर स्टेट क्या स्टेट भी क्या कर रहे हैं, वो दूसरे स्टेट को साइड करके ये बोल रहे हैं कि हाँ गुजरात ने किया तो हम भी करेंगे। तो उत्तर प्रदेश ने भी वही रीजन दिया था। पर प्रॉब्लम ये हो रहा है कि अगर आप ऐसे करोगे तो ये टेक ऑफ ही नहीं होगा। ये नया टेक्नोलॉजी है, अगर इसको टेक ऑफ करना है तो स्टेबिलिटी की जरूरत है, एंड वो स्टेबिलिटी कब आएगी, जब देयर इज अ प्रॉपर पॉलिसी। तो आपके क्वेश्चन अगर मैं डायरेक्टली आंसर करूं तो अगर हमको वो टारगेट्स अचीव करने हैं, वी नीड अ पॉलिसी विच इज कंसिस्टेंट अक्रॉस ऑल द स्टेट्स। सबसे पहली बात उसकी जरूरत है। उसके बाद देयर आर स्टेट स्पेसिफिक प्रॉब्लम जो स्टेट गवर्नमेंट्स को भी सॉल्व करना पड़ेगा। एंड वी हैव टू क्रिएट एन इकोनॉमी जहाँ पे प्राइवेट सेक्टर को भी ये मतलब अपॉर्चुनिटी दिखे उनको। अगर उनको वो अपॉर्चुनिटी दिखेगा वही मतलब टेक ऑफ हो जाएगा। ऐसा नहीं है कि प्राइवेट सेक्टर अगेंस्ट है। अभी प्राइवेट सेक्टर इज अगेंस्ट कोल, बट प्राइवेट सेक्टर इज एक्चुअली अनाउंसिंग लॉट ऑफ रेन्यूएबल्स टारगेट्स। रिलायंस ने 100 गीगावाट का कुछ किया था, टाटा पावर ने किया था, एनटीपीसी भी लाइक किया था, जो हमारे पब्लिक यूटिलिटी है। सो देयर इज अ लॉट ऑफ मोमेंटम ऑन आरई, पर पॉलिसी सपोर्ट की भी जरूरत है। एंड इट ऑल नीड्स टू स्टार्ट फ्रॉम द टॉप। एंड इसीलिए सब देख रहे हैं एनईपी, अभी जो नेशनल इलेक्ट्रिसिटी पॉलिसी अभी आने वाला है इस साल में, आई थिंक उस पे एवरीबडी इज लुकिंग वेरी केयरफुली अगर कुछ होगा या नहीं। एंड दैट विल डिटरमाइन अगर हम हमारे टारगेट्स रीच करें। आई जस्ट लीव विद वन स्टैटिस्टिक। ये 450 गीगावाट्स का टारगेट जो भी है, अगर इफ वी हैव टू मीट इट, we need to add 42 gigawatts every year, 42 gigawatts of renewables every year. And अभी हमारा रिकॉर्ड है बस 10। we've hit 10 or 11 gigawatts last year. We need almost fourfold increase going forward. It's a big task, but I think we need to wake up now and we need to start acting now. अभी से करना पड़ेगा।
Can I just chip in here? I think this is also one of the challenges in a way, because I see that there's always these numbers floating around of 450 gigawatts, 500 gigawatts, and while the emphasis has been on capacity addition per se, I think that's kind of also going in the wrong direction, right? So it's not just about adding capacity. When I think Parth also touched on this, so we need to think from it from a systems perspective, right? So just adding more and more renewables will not really help solve a lot of the issues, but then we also have to think about how do you complement that addition, right? So you have to think about storage solutions, you have to think about flexible solutions, you have to think about the various complementary solutions that will go along with actually ensuring that you have a functioning system at that level of renewable energy penetration. So I think while the policy is, trying to be ambitious and trying to set goals of this big numbers, I think that the need for like breaking this down into what it actually means for the system and how we can accommodate this level of or this 450 gigawatts of renewables in the system is the next question. Because what has happened now, when I'm also speaking to some of the utilities in Karnataka and also in Gujarat, is like they had these ambitious targets, they had this capacity addition drive of saying, okay, we add this, but then now they're saying, okay, we've added too much solar and wind and we need to curtail them, because at point and in some certain days of the year they have more than 50-60% of renewables in the system, and they can't really handle this. And so now they are sort of waking up to these different solutions as to saying, how do we manage this sort of variability of, because wind and solar is variable, and then we need solutions such as batteries, and then now they're talking about these gas peakers, which is like trying to then meet in the kind of peaks that will be created. So I think the thinking, while is good that we should welcome the ambition, we should also then say, okay, what does this mean for the whole energy system for the country? And can we sort of think about it more comprehensively rather than just saying, okay, this target and this target?
Thank you, Manish, for your insights. बात पॉलिसीज की हुई और आदित्य ने अभी कहा कि नॉर्दर्न ग्रिड के डिकार्बनाइजेशन के लिए ये ज़रूरी है कि सेंट्रल लेवल पे अक्रॉस ऑल स्टेट्स एक स्ट्रॉन्ग पॉलिसी चाहिए। तो मेरा ये क्वेश्चन है पार्थ आपके लिए कि what is the best pathway towards designing such a policy package which can contribute towards India's commitments, which can align with 1.5 degree of Paris Agreement, keeping the principles of equity and justice in mind.
Right. So I mean, my group at CPR and I, of course, we are sort of that school of thought that it should vary state by state. I mean, I think my personal take, Aditya, is slightly different from yours. I feel like a strong, uniform policy framework at the national level is fine, but really the solutions have to be state specific. Because I mean, we know where the resources are concentrated for solar and wind. We also know that in north and east, possibly hydro is more of a solution if you can find it, if you can do it in a way that doesn't damage the ecology too much. The jobs are sort of different, and each state has its own history, which makes it slightly difficult to sort of have a uniform policy in all states, right? So, जैसे कि आपने गुजरात, राजस्थान, AP, कर्नाटका, मतलब इन states ने already RE में काफी सारा invest कर दिया है, right? And some of them, like Manish ने already बोला कि some of them are now thinking कि हम इसको integrate कैसे करें, and we have not made that much progress in terms of storage and grid integration and those kinds of policies which will allow like better and simpler trade between states. The transmission network is not ready to sort of allow trade between states, and also, for example, regional trade with Bangladesh. So all of those things are lacking. And now if you have a uniform policy which sort of pushes more renewables on these states, they will actually get into trouble, right? Like with Andhra Pradesh, for example, we were looking at some of the numbers, and last 2 years में उन्होंने short term power purchase market से जितना energy खरीदा है, that is actually 7 times what the commission allowed in the tariff petition. Right? So they are actually really struggling to integrate. Even their best estimate is 7 times less than what they need to actually manage the variability. So my sense is it should be state by state, but the center can come in very important places. So one place I think the center should come in is clarity on whether you want to push deployment or manufacturing, because they keep changing. Like कभी custom duty डाल दिया, कभी बोल रहे हैं कि हम production linked करना चाहेंगे, कभी बोल रहे हैं कि हम like there's some lobbies who want more manufacturing, so then they sort of make the panel import more expensive. Then suddenly they go back and नहीं target करना है तो फिर China से cheap panel मंगवा लो. So clarity on that side, clarity on the markets, clarity on the use of sort of the interstate transmission network, some long-term clarity on whether the जैसे solar or wind को आज की तारीख में they have some exemptions in terms of the transmission charges for using the interstate transmission system. So if that is right now going to expire in 2025, that's a big subsidy to solar, right? So कल को अगर आपने वो हटा दिया, then a lot of these projects will become unviable. So those kinds of things the center should actually get into and give clarity, but then like the center of gravity of the policy decisions should be with the states. I really strongly believe that. Jharkhand as a state, I feel like you probably don't need it to become a solar leader, right? Like even if you have like you can, it's not like you can't, but it's not something that should be thrust upon the state to meet the national target. If the chief minister there decides that we want to put a lot of solar in our agricultural areas and sort of stimulate our rural economy, then that's their decision. But if you sort of burden them with capacity that they don't need, then their discoms will become sort of non-performing, and then that actually drags the whole system back. And so I think that's my perspective, and I'm completely open if others disagree with it.
I think I need to clarify something. I think मैं ये नहीं कह रहा कि like we need a same policy for every state. Of course, the solution is going to be different for different states because contexts are different, history is different, and quite frankly, like resources, availability of resources are different. So ये कह रहा हूँ कि policy framework जो है, I think there needs to be it needs to be in such a way that you have like top down जो भी policies है, it needs to marry with the bottom up realities. वो अभी नहीं हो रहा है. And right now, like we have these grand ambitions, and we also need the states to walk in the same direction. I guess I'm also from the same school of thought as you are thought, and I agree with everything that you've said. Solutions need to be different, but we need like a common framework जिसके हिसाब से हम चले, because right now we're not walking in the same direction as a country when it comes to climate change and 1.5 degrees, and that is what I meant when I said that.
Sure. I think
when sort of I agree that you do need the national perspective actually, because like Parth, you were saying yourself, like the resources are in different states, and I think it's the central body which will sort of be best suited to know which areas where the resources are and how the focus can shift, right? While the state in itself plans for its own energy demand and meeting its own energy needs in a way, but then if it can do more, then what? The incentive for it to do more, like similarly the case right now with Gujarat and Rajasthan, these states have fantastic resources, and what's their incentive to do a lot more than their targets? So I think there has to be a kind of a national coordinated sort of thinking. And like you said, if the transmission system needs to be well developed, then it has to be a central push. Because you can then definitely plan for evacuating a lot of the cheap solar from the western states to the eastern states, or create that kind of a mechanism where it could be possible. So I think there is room for both, and it's not either or, like we all know. It's going to be complementary of both these approaches.
I think we are past one, Seemaji. Please.
I don't have any. I'm done. I was just thanking everyone. It was very in-depth insights that came out of that.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Manish, Parth, Professor Samdarshi, and Aditya, all of you for taking the time. I think there is still so much more in this report, that we were not able to cover, but hopefully this was useful for our journalist fraternity as well. And with that, maybe we can close the session. As requested, if you are quoting anybody from the webinar, request you to please just check once, with the respective speakers. We can help you do that if needed. And we'll close it for the day. Thank you so much.
Thanks